In the spring of 1943, deep in the North Atlantic, the German U-boat fleet believed it possessed a perfect weapon of communication, one that made their submarines invisible on the airwaves. It was called the Kursignal system, the short signal burst, a method so fast, so compact, and so low-powered that, in theory, it could be transmitted in under 1 second. German engineers designed it with one purpose: to prevent Allied radio intercept stations from ever detecting a U-boat's position. It was the silent heartbeat of the Atlantic War, a pulse too fast for human operators to catch, too faint for conventional listening posts to hear, and too encrypted for anyone outside the U-boat command to understand. The Germans believed it was unbreakable. They believed no one could intercept it, and they believed no one could ever decrypt it. They were wrong. On a cold, gray morning in March 1943, inside a small hut at a coastal listening station in Scotland, a junior Allied radio operator noticed something strange on his receiver. It lasted less than a second, just a tiny, sharp spike of energy on a long-range antenna. Under normal conditions, he would have ignored it. Bursts like this appeared all the time. Atmospheric noise, lightning far across the ocean, or interference from civilian broadcast bands. But something in the rhythm of this spike made him pause. It was too clean, too deliberate, too artificial. He recorded the time in the logbook, marked the approximate signal strength, and switched to a wider listening band. To his surprise, he saw a second spike, and then nothing. Across the Atlantic, another station in Newfoundland detected the exact same spike at the exact same time on the exact same frequency range. A third listening post in Iceland caught a faint echo too. This triangulation, barely 3 scratches of static, suggested something the Allies had never clearly captured before: a German burst transmission from a U-boat somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, something that wasn't supposed to be detectable. The listening posts forwarded their logs to the direction finding headquarters. Analysts reviewed the signal and immediately realized what they were looking at. For months, they had suspected the Germans were using an ultra-short broadcast system, but no one had been able to prove it. Now, at last, they had a trace. But the problem was far from solved. A trace was not a message. It was merely proof that a message existed. Meanwhile, at Bletchley Park, codebreakers working on Naval Enigma had their own concerns. They knew the Germans feared Allied interception. The Kriegsmarine was the most paranoid branch of the German military when it came to wireless security. Their U-boat messages were already the hardest in Europe to break. Four-rotor Enigma, random call sign rotation, strict message discipline, and now this short signal system. If the Allies couldn't intercept the messages, then even a perfect decryption operation would be useless. You cannot decrypt what you cannot hear, but the burst signal detected that morning changed everything. The trace was sent to Bletchley Park, where cryptanalysts began reconstructing what the Germans might have transmitted. Although the Allies had captured Enigma material from you 559 months earlier, they still lacked crucial settings for the month's naval keys. Yet the existence of a signal allowed them to predict what kind of message it likely contained. U-boats didn't transmit at random. Every burst message had one of 3 purposes: reporting Allied convoys, requesting new orders, or coordinating a wolfpack attack. If they could determine which one, they could infer something about the U-boat's actions in that area. At the same time, long-range HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding, stations recalculated bearings. By measuring tiny differences in signal strength, they produced a rough location for the submarine. The result pointed to a region dangerously close to the route of an Allied convoy designated HX-229, a slow-moving formation of merchant ships carrying food, ammunition, and aviation fuel to Britain. Convoys like HX-229 were essential to keeping Britain alive, and they were exactly what Admiral Donat's U-boats were hunting. Bletchley Park analysts cross-referenced the tiny intercepted burst with recent Enigma decrypts. Several days earlier, they had decrypted a German weather report from a U-boat command station that referenced a special operations zone in the North Atlantic. Now, with the intercepted burst, they suspected the zone was active. But the question remained, what did the message say? Without content, the Allies were still blind. Then something extraordinary happened. A second burst was intercepted. This time the signal was slightly longer, maybe a second and a half. And because of atmospheric conditions, it bounced across the ocean in a way that allowed the British station, the Newfoundland station, and the Iceland station to record different parts of its waveform. When these fragments were combined, analysts realized they had captured not just the presence of a message, but enough of its structure to attempt reconstruction. They fed the waveform into an experimental wideband analyzer, equipment so new that some officers still didn't trust it. The machine expanded the squashed burst into a usable signal envelope. Suddenly, the meaningless spike became something with shape, rhythm, and structure. The analysts saw the familiar patterns of Kurzig nail compression. The truncated message blocks the Germans used to shorten long messages into tiny bursts. A breakthrough, but still not a readable message. The partially reconstructed signal was rushed to Bletchley Park. Cryptanalysts immediately started combining it with educated guesses about the U-boat's intentions. They knew the Germans always began burst signals with a unit identifier. They knew the rough position. They knew the time. They knew the convoy routes. Piece by piece, they aligned the signal with naval Enigma structures. Then they made a lucky guess. The message likely included a bearing and distance to a convoy sighting. Those always followed a predictable numeric pattern. 2 digits, a pause, 2 digits. From that assumption, the codebreakers aligned the partial decryption and suddenly found a fit. A fragment of the message translated to convoy sighted, requesting additional wolfpack units. The room fell silent. This meant the message, which was never supposed to be intercepted, contained the exact information the Germans were counting on: the coordinates and heading of a large Allied convoy. If the Germans received confirmation, they would redirect multiple U-boats to intercept it. A wolfpack attack could destroy dozens of ships in a single night. And the Allies had just captured the warning before the Germans even knew if the U-boat had been heard. Within the hour, Allied Naval Command ordered convoy HX-229 to change course. A sweeping maneuver turned the formation 15 degrees south, away from the trap. When the German command received the U-boat's burst message later that day, they assumed the submarine had not been detected. They redirected 3 additional U-boats to intercept the convoy at the original coordinates. The U-boats arrived to find nothing but empty ocean. Bletchley Park monitored the confused responses in decrypted Enigma traffic. German commanders believed the convoy must have changed course due to weather. They never suspected SIGINT. 2 days later, another Allied station intercepted a third burst from the same U-boat. Analysts reconstructed enough to understand the essence of the message. No contact. Fuel low. Returning to base. The wolfpack had failed. The convoy survived. Hundreds of sailors lived because of a tiny signal, one that was never supposed to be heard. This event changed Allied SIGINT strategy. For the first time, they realized it was possible to intercept German burst transmissions, even if only partially. They expanded experimental wideband receivers. They trained operators to look for faint, fast spikes. They recalibrated antennas. They pushed the limits of their equipment. Soon they were capturing dozens of burst signals a month. The Germans had no idea. Throughout 1943 and 1944, U-boats continued sending short burst messages, believing them undetectable. But the Allies were listening quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. The Kriegsmarine, once the most secure branch of German communications, had lost the advantage without even knowing it. In the decades after the war, historians struggled to understand how certain convoys had escaped destruction despite being spotted by U-boats. Many assumed luck. Some assumed weather. Only when wartime documents were declassified did the truth emerge. The Allies had intercepted messages that were not supposed to be interceptable. They had decrypted signals that were not supposed to be decryptable. They had turned the Germans' most secret communication method into an intelligence windfall. This story is one of the rare moments in World War II when intelligence, timing, and technology intersected in a way that changed the fate of hundreds of men at sea. A moment when a whisper in the static, a near-invisible burst, became the difference between life and death. It remains one of the least known victories of Allied code-breaking, and one of the clearest examples of how even a single intercepted message, one the enemy believed was impossible to detect, can alter the course of battle. Because in the silent war of signals, nothing is ever truly invisible.